funny story. I just decided to ask ChatGPT, what's it like to be a bat? Let me just read a couple things. It might be hilarious.
Planetary computation is the way that the world is evolving. And that, like, it's kind of like a Gaia theory, I'd say, framework.
Okay, cool. We made fire from rock. We made home. We have shelter. Great. Now we could oh, great, draw caveman drawings. Oh, like you meant this. Okay, like you drew bird. Oh, that's bird. Like we got to this point where, all right, we have all these different languages.
And it's because, like, if you just look at things on a pathophysiological basis, you don't actually see the homeostatic patterns. You just see like physical structures of organs, and you don't see what the organ structure is. And the homeostatic function is what's evolving, not the organ structure.
We produced a digital version of an eye through like an evolutionary algorithm. Are we talking about different languages here?
All right, everybody, welcome to the ABCs for Building the Future podcast. Today I have myself, Robert, Jonathan, and Deen, my co-founders on Epistemic Me, our project to solve AI alignment and more. We bring on, researchers, developers, scientists, founders, entrepreneurs, leaders who are on the front lines building the future, people with big stories, doing big things with big stories to tell. Today, we're going to be nerding out about a talk by this professor, Benjamin Bratton. He had a talk which was called A Philosophy of Planetary Computation, from Antikythera to Synthetic Intelligence. And in the first 5 minutes, he mentions epistemic or epistemology many times. And so this really intersects with what we do and kind of philosophy at the intersection of technology and AI. Really great talk. And we all listened to it as a team. And today we're just kind of riff and debrief some of our thinking. So the very first thing I guess I should say is this talk was about actually what maybe we should just go around and do a round of what was the message you got from the talk? Deen, you were kind of talking about this before we started. Do you want to go first, and then maybe Jonathan, and then myself, and then we can go into some of the topics that I've listed out?
Yeah, I think I heard two things from listening to the talk. One was the critique of epistemic institutions, which I'm going to be honest, I don't think I really fully grokked the argument there, and I'd be curious to understand what you guys have to say on that. And then the second part of it was this idea of emergent intelligence, planetary level intelligence, which I thought was interesting. I actually don't know too much about Bratton's background. So how much of it was kind of this hypothesis on what is intelligent from a philosophical perspective, or what's an interesting metaphor to apply to how we might view intelligence operating at the planetary scale? I wasn't really able to distinguish which side it fell. I thought it was a really useful way of framing. I've heard this idea from many other philosophers before, this idea of hierarchical intelligence, or intelligence emerging at different levels of abstraction. So all in all, yeah, it was a great listen. I actually just listened to it coming up from Slow. But yeah, that would be my high level thoughts. And then we can deep dive on some of the specific topics.
Cool. So criticism of epistemic institutions, and then kind of I think he in the talk he kind of talks about what you talk about is, I think, scaffolding and technology evolution, which we'll dive into a little bit. Jonathan, want to go next? Thanks, Deen.
Yeah, so let's see. I think he had this hypothesis that that planetary computation is the way that the world is evolving, and that, like, it's kind of like a Gaia theory, I'd say, framework, where what we see happening with technology and the evolution of biology through time was like an early phase of the planet evolving, and then computation is kind of like taking it to this next level where everything's becoming interconnected, and he kind of projects into the new sphere, which is a sci-fi kind of futuristic term for when all beings on Earth are intersubjectively connected through this computational kind of substrate. So, and he says that this computational evolution is kind of unstoppable. It is and the Antikythera name comes from, of course, this Greek device that was found from about 200 BC that would track the planetary motions. So like in the sky, right? So it was like a computational device that was like far beyond the capabilities that we thought the Greeks could do at the time. And that's the name of the foundation. And it's kind of like the metaphor for his theory. And he started off with a lot of like rich language around philosophy. I think he comes from a social sciences background versus a hard sciences background. And so he was like really kind of like putting some of the tools they use in social sciences as a frame for how to look at computation, how to look at the way things are evolving. And then his thesis was that this stuff is happening so fast and it is so complex that we need new concepts, new philosophy to be able to have explanatory power, that can even tell us like where things are going. And that's where he introduces the needs for epistemic institutions, which is clearly kind of like a knock on the university and academia structure working on the wrong problems, and that he wants to work on the right problems and have philosophy as a tool to give us language to work on the right problems.
That the Antikythera thing was super cool. I think it's a cool name. It was hard for me to say at first. But yeah, the history of it is quite fascinating. And I guess thanks, Jonathan. I guess for my own takeaways from it, the biggest, so yeah, two takeaways. One was the criticism of epistemic institutions, which I kind of mapped to we live in capitalism. We are not able to sufficiently allow science to answer the questions that need to be answered within capitalism. That was my high level take. We could talk about that a little bit and debate that. The other take was that really big thing that I got out of it was apes made fire from rock. Now we put intelligence into rocks, and now we got to figure that out. and he has this entire idea of scaffolding and technology evolution, which poses, at least hearing him talk, this is what I was thinking, poses the question of like, hey, we keep centering ourselves as humanity of our own evolution, and we look at evolution, but actually aren't we, maybe we're just a blip that helps materialize planetary computation the way that the planet and the universe needs to actuate. So instead of looking as humans as the center of everything, just seeing us as also parts of technology evolution, or part of the evolution of the universe, and playing a role there in things like intelligence, sense making, creating language to make sense of things, and then artificializing intelligence, which we'll get into a bit. But those are some of my takes on it, that I got out of it. He also talks a little bit about assembly theory. He also says some interesting things. Like one thing he said was sciences are born when philosophy learns to ask the right questions. Philosophies are born when technologies force the birth of new languages. And one thing he really said was we need new nouns to describe this. This does intersect a lot with discussions we have in Slack, where we see that I think, Jonathan, you mentioned this. Was it the CEO of DeepMind that mentioned that we really need philosophy to kind of, he didn't say this, but hey, philosophy, could you level up your game so we know what we're doing on the technology side? I don't think he exactly said that, but something like that. What was that, Jonathan?
Yeah, pretty much. I think he said there's an urgent need for philosophy, like to solve the problems of AI and computation. And this is the guy that, makes AlphaFold. you know, he needs ways to conceptualize like how proteins fold and how cells work and stuff like that.
So lots of topics, so many different things. And I think maybe where we start is that criticism of epistemic institutions. Deen, you kind of mentioned like maybe you didn't quite grok like what the message was. Jonathan, do you want to start with the whole like how did you receive that, his criticism of epistemic institutions, and then we could layer in discussion from there.
Yeah, it was a really interesting evening for me because I saw the event live at the Long Now Foundation, and this was like that week that DeepSeek came out, and everybody was talking about this, and like the world's changing so fast, um, and then so that was the premise of the presentation, and I wasn't expecting it to be about AI actually, but it was all about AI. And then at the end of the presentation, he introduced his organization, this Antikythera, organization where he has these kind of what he calls them studios in different cities. He's clearly trying to create a new kind of epistemic institution. And so I think like he's got a certain thing in mind when he's going to bring together great brains that are working on problems that are related to like how AI impacts human evolution, and he's going to like create grants and sponsorships and get really smart people in these different cities to like brainstorm and sort of rethink the philosophy of what's happening and run different experiments. And he have a lot of examples of the things he's already done in different cities. So I think what he was calling epistemic institutions, he presented pretty concretely as like what his organization is kind of trying to do. And I think he's very disillusioned with I think maybe it was UC Santa Barbara where he works.
San
That
Diego. San Diego.
UC San Diego. Okay, cool. Yeah. Where he just doesn't think like, they're able to kind of reformulate the questions of the day and meet the challenge technology is giving and pushing on the questions of philosophy.
I guess the
Yeah.
question is like, what new epistemology or what new process is he proposing that would prevent his institution from repeating uh, the exact same problems of the institutions he's criticizing? I think there's like interesting examples of like institutions which operated with completely different epistemologies. For example, like AT&T Bell Labs. I think we could definitely go there if we want to like compare and contrast all these different examples of epistemic institutions. But I think that's the one thing I was struggling to understand. It's like, I mean, like there's been many institutes like the Santa Fe Institute, which have just tried to get a bunch of smart people together, but ultimately, oftentimes those also fall under dogma, or they fall under the same problems as like the university. So I'm curious if he talked about it all, how he plans to avoid that.
I don't think he talked about it in detail. I just reviewed the talk like a couple hours ago. It's a little fresh in my head, but his main thesis that I remember was he talked about how architecture, physical architecture, has benefited from this, money flowing in and humans wanting to figure out, hey, how do we like exist and organize ourselves with space and technology and being alive in respect to nature. And so he argues that architecture has been given space to breathe. Those are my own words, and that technology, and then also at the intersection of philosophy, uh, and I think knowledge, truth seeking as a process is a little capped in the software space in particular. He said particularly with software. So he said software needs also a home like that. So that's his whole thing is, hey, Antikythera is going to be, and this is the big question that I don't know the details to of like, did he just find a bunch of rich people that were like, yeah, you need to go answer these questions and not be beholden to anybody. Here's a bunch of money. But there is some, so I don't know the details of that and how uh, the double click, triple click, quadruple click details of like, how can we actually ensure the incentives are not misaligned so that you are actually finding truth. So I wouldn't be able to talk about that on this pod, but more so his thinking that current epistemic institutions like universities, academic research centers, um, and I've known this because my brother is a PhD in biophysics, so I've talked to him about this. I've talked to other friends who've gotten PhDs or masters. It becomes like a political game of let me get a grant to then be able to overlap with the question I really want to answer, but then I kind of have to answer this other thing that has kind of capitalism interests, right? So then I almost dilute my truth seeking process or my knowledge seeking process in um, this system. So then the question becomes like, well, at this point in time, with the birth of superintelligence, this is really not the right time to be capping our truth seeking. That was what I got out of it. So, Jonathan, did you have anything to add to that or react to that?
Yeah, I think that's really well articulated. I was just looking at the language on his webpage. This speculative studio culture comes to mind. Foundational questions of what computational systems are and could be, examines what is necessary and what isn't, and maps scenarios to test and chart trajectories accordingly. So I think that's kind of like the commitment he's made to his stakeholders, who seem to be like a large, European sponsor for the project. You know, like it's really interesting, and I think how you described, right, like this process of grant seeking. Everybody knows how broken it is and how disjointed it is from like the real questions you want to ask. And I think that's the kind of thing he's trying to like present a hypothesis for other ways to do that. But one of the key things that came across when I was like looking at the comments on the YouTube was that uh, people with that were using language of hard science were very critical of like his approach and the way he was. And I think he kind of exemplifies like this divide, that the philosophical divide between the hard sciences and the social sciences, who literally have to use different philosophical tools to solve their problem. And I think he's kind of saying like, hey, computational people have used hard science problems for all of history. Like let's bring some of these social science constructs such as philosophy into the equation now, because the technology needs it. And that is a controversial take, at least from the academic perspective.
It's interesting that we would say that software, or I guess technology, is more epistemically bound. It's because I actually don't see that at all. At all, I feel like I mean the recent advancements in AI, all going all the way back to the transformer, have come out of, you could argue, slightly more capitalist institutions who moved at a faster pace than the university system. So you could almost maybe argue that like capitalism, or the allocation of resources, is proving to be a sound epistemic strategy for producing better and better technology. That's almost like the perspective I would put on it, as opposed to, as opposed to needing. It's more of, it's actually less so about the resources, less so about the grant seeking, and more so about the rapid rate of iteration, and like being able to like show that you're correct. And that's one thing that capitalism seems to offer very well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you present it that way, because I think it's been this kind of like there's been an intellectual battle about like how technology should evolve, and
Mhm.
analytic philosophy in capitalism has been what has worked and what has always worked. And then all along the way, there's always like a philosophy, call it, from the direction of continental philosophy, or system sciences, or consciousness philosophy, that says, no, this is inhumane. We're like, we're not considering the human problem in this, both in the capitalism and in the like the progression of analytic technology. But like what produced transformers? And I think that was clearly just like capitalistic investment, bigger analytic technology, faster hypotheses being tested, like you said, and results.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and intersect. I guess adding to the conversation on like the other take is I've been reading this book, Super Agency. We have it in our little book club. If anybody wants to join, feel free. Like hit us up. And they Reid Hoffman actually argues a similar thing, Deen, um, and he argues that how so he argues that there's these. Let me just describe these nouns he uses. There's broad brush kind of labels of the different four types of people in the discourse of AI at the intersection of like ethics and rapid rate of technology evolution, implications on humanity in the universe. So there are doomers who believe we're on a path to the future where worst case scenarios, super intelligent, completely autonomous AIs that are no longer well aligned with human values may decide to destroy us altogether. Except perhaps, and he literally says this, except perhaps for a small contingent of tech bros whom they'll keep around to do the vacuuming as revenge on behalf of Roombas. I thought that was hilarious. Gloomers, it's the second broad brush label, are both highly critical of AI and highly critical of doomers. And in their estimation, the doomer outlook serves dual purposes. First, it exists as a tacit endorsement of AI. It's so powerful, it just might destroy us. Second, its long term and abstract nature misdirects attention towards the future, where our real priority should be more near term AI risks, loss of potential jobs, disinformation, misinformation, amplification of existing systemic biases. So that's gloomers. They favor a prohibitive top down, let's stop everything kind of approach, or highly regulated approach. In contrast, so there's a third one, Zoomers. Zoomers argue that the productivity gains and innovation AI will far exceed any negative impact it produces. So they're skeptical of the idea of precautionary regulation. And then finally, there are the bloomers. So the super optimistic people, kind of like Zoomers, they're optimistic, and they believe AI can accelerate human progress in countless domains. And at the same time, they recognize that a technology as transformative as AI cannot and should not be developed or deployed in a unilateral fashion. So Hoffman kind of sees himself as a bloomer, that very optimistic, and tying back to what we're talking about with how capitalism has really funded rapid, iterative experiments, the evolution of transformers. He has this term called iterative deployment, which is OpenAI's model of we're just going to ship and get as many users on Earth to use it. And in that way, we can have them participate in the creation of this new technology or influence it. So I thought that was a very interesting take, which is like, oh, actually, if you think about it, you and Benjamin Bratton kind of talks about this too. It's like you can be a user for $20 a month for a monthly subscription, and then you could actually, like, if you wanted, influence the roadmap. And in a way, it's like, well, there's hundreds of millions of users all across the globe, very diverse perspectives, very diverse backgrounds, kind of funneling in feedback to evolve at least these products from that OpenAI use case. I thought that was interesting. I haven't quite formed an opinion on that. Dean, I see you nodding. I'd love to hear what
Yeah,
thoughts you might have.
I love that little tidbit about, like, you mentioned like subscriptions as a way to democratize access to technology, and it's interesting because I work at Stripe, and so I'm very familiar with the subscriptions business and the way that works. Um, and yeah, I mean, in many ways, actually, I feel like subscriptions gets a bad rap. Like, many people consider it to be like a poor user experience, or it's ruining the way in which I buy products. I can't pay a single fee anymore to access my product forever. I'm like kind of bound to this like continuous income cash flow. But yeah, it actually was a very cheap way to democratize intelligence. You could argue that if I had to buy the product one off, uh, the first iterations of ChatGPT would have been prohibitively expensive. Now they can actually launch these different subscriptions, and without knowing the cost economics of AI in the future, they have the capacity to launch new subscriptions, change the tiering model. We actually see that with Pro and Plus. It allows you to monetize and economize the technology in a very different way, which oftentimes we don't see as being important, but it is very important. And in this way, it is one of the fastest technologies to democratize by any means.
Yeah, just to put a number to how fast, I think it was, they got, after a month of ChatGPT launching, they had 100 million users, which is really fast, right? So one could zoom out and argue what other technology has allowed such expansion of democratization of influence of user feedback towards a product than ChatGPT or AI. And also, what's interesting on the other hand, you always hear this news of like, Sam Altman's evil, like they're going to destroy the world, like that kind of thing. Obviously, like with these new nouns, I think that's more of the doomer. Jonathan, I'd love to hear your take on this.
Yes, I think if you look at those categories or like the decelerist or accelerationist point of view, I think it matters like how you believe in the status quo and like the forces of progression to this point. And I think if you look at capitalism and analytic philosophy that have like produced a lot of technical innovations, they're like one of the things that or two of the things they don't do well. One of them is that they don't model subjectivity well. They just sort of don't have a metaphysical premise on the world. They assume that like all observers observe the same world and the cause effect relationships are the same for all of us. And two, it doesn't model evolution well or at all. Like there are literally no strong theories of in analytic philosophy of evolution or how we got here, and that's teleological. And in fact, I think Bratton in the presentation like used artificialization as his construct of teleology and teleological progression. So that he's bringing in philosophy that he thinks is like where he's saying the status quo is going to solve these problems, right? Um, but I think where it comes to that rapid feedback loop, and like, okay, how do you really interpret like what values the people are getting out of the software that they're using in terms of like just product management and value definition and constructing the language to get feedback? Um, I think that's where like when you have such a mass democratization of a tool and you're getting feedback from so many different positions and perspectives, how do you collate that? And that's what sort of epistemic me is about. Is let's give it like a specific lens or frame for every single individual and their individuality and their subjectivity to like contextualize the feedback that they're giving. And the hypothesis is that that's a more meaningful way to interpret the data and to make the next change and test the next set of hypotheses in a system. That's how I'd look at it.
Yeah, that was super interesting what you said about how analytic philosophy doesn't address evolution. I wonder if we could double click into that and explain in your perspective why that is. Because I don't think I can put into my own words why analytic philosophy wouldn't be able to describe evolution.
Yeah, I think when it comes to like fitness functions, and I will say, like in the presentation, they mentioned assembly theory, which like the whole goal of assembly theory was actually to like put out a definition of evolution, and the founders of it said we don't have one yet. Like, so this is this is a concrete mathematical definition of evolution, and it's coming from people in chemistry, interestingly, the chemistry field. So so I think it's a like a grounded perspective to say like there is no universal analytic theory of evolution, and there just isn't one, and why, right? I think you have to look at like if you're actually going to contextualize like population and fitness, it really comes down to like modeling consciousness and subjectivity of the fitness criteria that are actually selective of environment. And I think one thing that's illustrative of this is the ORP ontology ontology ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which was this theory in the 19th century when they would cut open cadavers of animals. They would like look for progressions like of like from fish to mammal to see like do the organs inside of the animals represent the evolutionary changes that we'd expect, and they don't. And it's because like if you just look at things on a pathophysiological basis, you don't actually see the homeostatic patterns. You just see like physical structures of organs, and you don't see what the organ structure is. And the homeostatic function is what's evolving, not the organ structure. So they're kind of like just taking a view of objectivity that doesn't actually lend itself to theories of evolution. And so uh, I think I think that's why there's no theory of evolution coming from analytic philosophy.
Would maybe it's helpful for the audience for us to define analytic philosophy? Like how would you describe analytic philosophy?
Yeah, I think I mean you had Kant, and then you had Boole responding to Kant, and so Boolean philosophy is like what we use in our computer systems today. Frege was the German philosopher who like really kind of like took epistemology into like a mathematical domain, and then there's a kind of a constant march of analytic philosophers between Frege and Quine. Quine wrote the two dogmas of the empiricism, and like I would say, like our current modern philosophy of science hasn't evolved much past Quine. And he kind of like collapsed metaphysics. He says metaphysics doesn't matter. Teleology doesn't matter. All that matters is epistemology and these reference frames that we can use to like define cause-effect relationships.
Yeah.
And so there would be like people that say there is no philosophy other than analytic philosophy, and the term continental philosophy was a pejorative term put by the imperial British onto the continent of France and Germany, saying that like this is kind of an inferior philosophy, but the real philosophy is over here in analytic philosophy, and it's all about error correction and then the logical completion of analytic philosophy is the transformer. Like it's like if you take all the concept of analytic philosophy and just like stuff it into a mathematical construct with all the compute in the world, I think that's where you get. So that's how I look at it.
So do evolutionary algorithms, which are also something we can reproduce today in, I guess, using outcomes of analytical philosophy, like Boolean transformations. I think there was like an MIT research group that recently reproduced a digital version of an eye through like an evolutionary algorithm. Like, do those ultimately not are we talking about different languages here when we talk about evolution? Do you see this like homeostatic? I forget the exact word you use there, but the underlying homeostatic process, as opposed to just the structure that's being evolved, the inability to represent that is the failure of analytical philosophy, or is that where like an evolutionary algorithm maybe doesn't match up to what we would traditionally think of as evolution?
Yeah, exactly. I think like if you took that kind of computational evolution and you don't put like metaphysical theories around what it is that is being evolved in terms of the fitness functions, like if you
Mm,
just take any random objective parameter of a system and you call it and you say that we're going to evolve this through like trial and error and population fitness, um, that like that's not what natural selection is in our historical biological nature. um, so so I think it's like a mismatch of like the if we take like a parameter that we can measure of a system and we don't map it back to like a homeostatic or metaphysically conscious sort of like selection criteria, then isn't like really a complete theory of of evolution, and I don't think it would also be like pass peer review. Like if you asked 100 scientists to review like what the model of evolution is that model used, they would say, well, I disagree with the way this is modeled. I disagree with, and sort of like the underlying theory would fall apart.
So are they disagreeing that you have successfully modeled what evolution is? But they're not necessarily disagreeing with the fact that evolutionary pressure can produce artifacts. Uh, and you see those as two different things, right? That the evolution that takes place within, like as we see it out there in the world through organisms, is different than the evolution that we've produced in this synthetic environment. And basically, there's no evidence to say that they are the same underlying process.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the goals of assembly theory, was to say that like you can have, through the complexity index of a molecule, that you can have a way to like put a quantitative characteristic that shows evolution happens, and where you can show that a system is evolving from like a less complex molecule to a more complex molecule that requires some like event in time to happen to like you take it from one complexity state to the other. And that's their way of sort of creating a meaningful epistemology of like change in an evolutionary system.
Are there any parallels with that between those who would say that like you just run any kind of transformer algorithm over some abstract concept, let's say one that's like embedded in like human information, like God, right? There's some teleology embedded in my language. I run a transformer over it. It seems to somehow compress language tokens into that abstract concept, and now can speak about human teleology as if it were human. Is that really, or is there a parallel to be drawn there, whether like the actual abstraction is the original abstraction, or are we talking about different concepts here? Is it, I guess what I'm trying to point at, is it a definitional problem in terms of like not actually having the proof? What is the hypothesis? Yeah, and I guess I'm just trying to understand, is it actually a definitional problem, or is it something more?
Yeah, the way you asked the question was like actually how I interpreted Bratton's presentation when he talked about like technology itself is evolving. And because I was thinking that like you were saying is it our language of teleology in our maybe our religion of teleology is evolving, and can we look at that? Can we look at the language that we're speaking and then identify patterns of evolution? Like I think of language is a technology. It's not a living being. Like he talks about computation as evolving, but not as a living being. And he says like technology itself is evolving. It's just sort of like a really interesting question, and I wouldn't answer it absolutely. I tend to think of like things that are conscious are evolving, and that's what evolution has historically evolved. At least all of my ancestors were conscious, except like what happened before we had the substrate of DNA, right? um, then there was something that kind of had evolutionary characteristics that produced a reproducible sort of like programmable substrate by which all my cells are built on. And do we say that it's meaningful to describe the evolution of that substrate versus the evolution of the homeostatic processes that the substrate kind of facilitates? And I've like pretty strongly just thought like, well, technology is the tool by which like we as humans or animals or cells, technology is the tool by which we like fulfill our homeostatic processes. So the teleology is the tool that I use to like fulfill questions I need to answer in life, about like how I got here or something like that. Uh, and it itself like is not evolving, but like the culture is evolving, and the way we share those ideas and the way it like that represents itself on the substrate of our minds is kind of like evolving collectively, and that's real.
Yeah. So is the question whether the process of evolution, that I think you framed it really interestingly, like uh, during the process of evolution, and we can assume at one point in time consciousness emerged. Like let's assume that to be true. The evolution that takes place on the structures that lead up to consciousness versus the evolution that takes place within consciousness on on thought, on beliefs, on culture. You're basically not convinced that they are the same process, or do you have a hypothesis that they are the same process?
um yeah, like I mean, so Hoffman goes all the way to the extreme and says that like there's nothing more foundational than consciousness, and
Yeah.
even like quarks in an atom have some kind of like conscious representation. And like, I don't know whether that's like whether that's actually just pushing the question to a ludicrous situation, or if it's actually like the most meaningful way to look at it. Like,
Yeah.
uh, I
I
don't know.
don't think that's a claim on ontology or yeah, because I do think he came to that conclusion through meditation, and I actually don't claim I don't think that's a claim on like ontology or how the structures of consciousness emerged. From my perspective, sorry if I'm cutting out, so my internet isn't stable. I think it's proposing consciousness as the ultimate ontology, right? And it's basically saying, well, I actually don't know if anything exists beyond consciousness, and maybe that's the only thing that's existed forever. I think Bernardo Kastrup actually does a pretty good job of talking about this, where he essentially says, okay, you're either going to investigate consciousness as the ultimate phenomenon, or you're going to try and explain the world through analytic philosophy, and both things contradict each other. Like you're either one domain or the other. You're either investigating the world through pure consciousness, or you're engaging in analytic philosophy. And don't mix the two, because ultimately one refutes the other, and you need to choose which domain you're talking about. And oftentimes when people try to talk about them as if they're the same thing, like try and explain the emergence of the world as if you were not if as if you were speaking in a dualistic standpoint, while at the same time trying to talk through a non-dualistic lens. Like obviously it's going to be super confusing, and I actually kind of agree with that. You need to pick one reference frame or the other, otherwise like you're just confusing yourself.
Zooming out a little bit, it's interesting because Bratton talks about there's a couple things I'll just reference from the presentation that intersect with this discussion and dialogue really well. He poses this thing from Bogna Konir. I don't know if I did justice to pronouncing that, but I'll drop in the show notes. What if humans are a phase in the history of technology? And then, intelligence, consciousness, those allow computation, those allow sense making. We create languages. And so zooming out, one of the things I was thinking is those two separate ways of looking at the world that you just named. If we just zoomed out and we're like, all right, we're all in the matrix as a simulation, let's just take the time slider and move it to infinity, which one wins, right? Like, I think Bratton's philosophy is that, and this is my interpretation to preface, I think he's saying, hey, like that whole thing, whatever it converges to, is part of a greater scaffolding. And humans duking it out on the philosophical terrain or domain is a form of evolution and technology evolution at the same time. And he also says this thing, which is computation is now the primary technology for the artificialization of functional intelligence, symbolic thought, and of life itself, aka at least how I map this in my brain, and also for the viewers, like these are very complicated topics. I myself don't have like 100% breadth and depth of all of these, but this is how I'm making sense of it, and that's what the discussion is about. Um, and it's pretty fun to talk about these things. So he talks about how, okay, cool, we made fire from rock, we made home, we have shelter, great. Now we could like, oh, great, draw caveman drawings. Oh, like you meant this. Okay, like you drew bird. Oh, that's bird. Like we got to this point where, all right, we have all these different languages. We're kind of converging. And then now we've created this thing that could process way more data than the human brain can. So now, kind of like the magnifying lens allows us sensors on a certain kind of data that we can't see with our eyes, artificial intelligence is another tool of sense making, right? And now you can even argue like the terms that we're using, like the whole we need new nouns thing. Um, Even the nouns we used before, like doomers, gloomers, or whatever, like you could even argue that came out of artificial intelligence, right? Like it forced us to create those nouns to categorize people. And so I think one of the points that I really got strongly was um, we're now in this loop of, hey, we have artificial intelligence helping us make sense of the world more with human intelligence. We're gaining more intelligence there. We're creating more symbolic language, which then feeds back into artificial intelligence, which has this like hyper feedback loop. And he has a great screenshot of that. I'll try to attach that in the show notes somehow. Um, but yeah, I'd love so for the audience, I know we kind of went all over the place, like epistemic institutions, criticism, capitalism, whether it's good, bad, evolves technology or whatever. We talked about the whole open AI use case of democratization of feedback loops back to what is value to drive this technology. It becomes kind of a product problem. There's subjectivity involved through the lenses of giving that feedback, like Jonathan mentioned, which, shout out, quick plug, Epistemic Me could help solve that if we take this time slider to infinity, which we want to do to help progress science faster, better, in a more democratized way. And now, I guess, this conversation, let's see, where should we take this? I don't want to like dead end that thought that y'all had. I wanted to layer some things, and I also wanted to zoom out for the audience to just be like, yo, like, where are we at? So yeah, I'll just repeat that last quote, which is, computation is now the primary technology for the artificialization of functional intelligence, symbolic thought, and of life itself. And I like that magnifying glass example. If you just think about artificial intelligence as the best magnifying glass in existence, it's helping you make more sense of the world, but then you also need, it'll help us co-create symbolic language. And then maybe there's one other thing I'll add as a quote, and I'd love both of your reactions to this. He says, AI will teach us as much about what thinking is than we will teach it. So alignment must be bidirectional between AI and society. So I'd love to layer that in and get both of your reactions on that.
Yeah, I think starting with Dean's framing about this, like, going back and forth between, say, philosophy of consciousness and analytic philosophy, I think if you look at those as like adaptive strategies that could play out in an evolving system. I saw this like when I needed to know how cells evolved into multicellular animals in 2008 or 2018 rather, and so I like did a whole project and I did all the research and figured out like how cells were made and like how they kind of made the jump to the basal ganglia, at least in our branch of the evolutionary tree. But I kept seeing this pattern, like where like in hops of say like 800 million years, cells would evolve where they first like kind of come up with these external adaptations, and then they would come up with internal adaptations. And like examples would be cells that could identify external like cells to be able to let them through their cell walls was like a first set of adaptations in. Sexual reproduction was one that came like afterwards, and like when you kind of like look at the history, it's kind of obvious. Like once you exploit a set of analytic external adaptations, like like once you explore that space, then you can exploit that space. Is what I meant to say. And then it becomes like more energy efficient to then like switch to the consciousness philosophy and then explore adaptations in that space and exploit expectations in that space. And so I just think there's like that evolution has kind of like this natural back and forth of like exploring and exploiting along the lines of what we call these two different philosophical lenses. And I think Bratton's presentation gave me a word for that I hadn't seen yet, which is artificialization, where he called like when you start to see like this persistent thing in your environment that you can kind of like you can bring into your own subjectivity. And he has this as like a teleological construct of evolution. And so I think when he's saying that we're like at this juncture where computation is like, we need to artificialize it or it's artificializing us. It is just, it's like the toggle switching to where we've pushed analytic philosophy to this point where the incremental adaptations that we can find through analytic philosophy are kind of like diminishing, whereas there are like huge opportunities for the consciousness philosophy to fill the gaps and to provide like evolutionary fitness in the computational human systems that we're talking about.
Like another way to phrase that, would that essentially be a jump to the world of the abstract, where to his point of like talking about nouns, like our nouns now shift to these larger, more abstract concepts, which are purely a function of consciousness. And all of our operations of computation exist on the abstract realm, which is, I think, something that almost every programmer is pretty familiar with. Like when you write a program, like this is the concept of like object-oriented programming. You create these objects or these abstract ideas that have methods, can call each other. And so you're doing all this thinking in this like mathematical platonic world that you've created. And you're no longer interfacing with actual reality. You could argue that those symbols are supposed to be representative of reality so that you can actually do useful things in the real world. But at the end of the day, all of your internal computation, like your simulation of your program that you are writing, is happening within your head and happening upon abstract entities. And maybe what he's arguing is that the mind of the programmer is now going to become the default state of the collective consciousness of society, where now we are progressively operating in this Platonic realm, and that's the need of philosophy to help us make sense of this world of computation that's dealing purely in the abstract realm. That's maybe one way to phrase it.
Yeah, it's so interesting to phrase it that way. And you reminded me with like at this point in super agency that Socrates was basically illiterate because
Yeah,
he refused to like value writing. He said, and so, and I think literacy gave us like the ability to abstract thought beyond the phenomenological senses that we shared. Like we shared sense making makes for shared dialogue together. But then if you can write it down and pass it along, somebody can like interpret what you mean abstractly and then add on to it. And like our analytic sciences especially are able to like really articulately abstract a domain into like very like nuanced terms and niche terminologies and specialties and specializations. Um, and then when you talk about like abstraction being applied to like philosophies of consciousness, I think like we're kind of limited to our philosophies of consciousness right now, is in like what we can sort of perspective take from one another in person, and we don't have a canvas like writing where we can like actually like put ourselves in one another's shoes, empathize, feel what we feel. What does it mean to be a bat, right? Like this is the famous paper. Like we know that's the hard problem of consciousness, and like we literally have no ways to abstract our understanding beyond the phenomenological to understand like how we see, feel, and what agency is for different beings. And I think that's the philosophical opportunity is, yeah, maybe the abstraction that we've given to objectivity, to language, to analytic philosophy, coming back towards theory, to philosophy of consciousness.
yeah, that's a great way to phrase it. I think like in another like I think to put another way, like we're finally solving the problem of like, does green look the same way to every single person, right? Because historically,
Yeah.
like language has never been able to describe that. You need something beyond that actually models consciousness to be able to express that.
You know what's interesting about that? So Bratton talks about um, uh, climate change actually as the result of technology evolution. Like we have all these sensors now, we can actually even make sense of the fact that climate change is real, and we can measure it. And there's lots of different things that go towards that. And one of the things I was thinking is as technology evolves, it allows us to do more artificialization, to gain more sense making and get more intelligence. And that just feeds back into each other recursively. And so one example I had thought of as you two were speaking about the bat problem and then the are we both seeing the same green problem is um, well, like knowing that you're seeing the same thing, um, I wonder if that could be solved for with like VR or something in the future, right? Like, could we like map out a bat, like, take the time slider to infinity? Could we like map out a bat and their experience and stuff like that, put that in VR, and then we're closer? I don't
I
know if we'll ever get
I think
100%, but like, go ahead, Dean.
I think you end up with the same philosophical problem, which is like, is my consciousness interpreting the VR, or is the VR
True.
bypassing my consciousness? And if we were to bypass my consciousness, is that even the same person? Like, is the consciousness that was acting as the substrate, was that me, or is the thing that is actually beyond consciousness me? Like, you end up with the same philosophical can of worms as you do when you just
True.
ask, am I seeing the same green?
True, true. I did want to read that part about Socrates because I think it might be interesting for the audience. I didn't realize this, but so okay, yeah. Roughly 2,400 years ago, Socrates critiqued the written word for its lack of dynamism in Plato's Phaedrus, and for the way it made knowledge accessible to anyone. You know, Phaedrus, writing shares a strange feature with painting. The offsprings of painting stand there as if they are alive, but anyone asks them anything, they remain most solemnly silent. The same is true of written words. You'd think they were speaking as if they had some understanding, but if you question anything that has been said because you want to learn more, it continues to signify just that very same thing forever. When it has once been written down, every discourse rolls about everywhere, reaching indiscriminately those with understanding no less than those who have no business with it. And it doesn't know to whom it should speak and to whom it should not. For Socrates, apparently, fixing his thoughts into written text represented a loss of agency. I wonder how he would think about us making a Socrates ChatGPT out of all his works. That's pretty good
That's
point.
hilarious, man.
Would he be more inclined to be like, yeah, actually the ChatGPT thing, now that I get it and I'm up to speed on all of technology, like this is a better representation of my ideas.
It's just so ironic. Like the guy, he was opposed to language misrepresented him. Now, like everybody knows this guy's name, but they don't know the version of him that he wanted to represent. And then it's just, I mean, it's just incredibly ironic the whole thing. And I'm quite sure he'd be opposed to like an LLM making a model of him and thinking it's anything like him. You know, um, but I think a lot of people would feel that way too.
Yeah, the real irony is we only know about Socrates because of Plato, who wrote about him.
Captured him in writing. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so funny.
That is super, super funny.
I
Do
feel
we
like,
want to?
go ahead.
Go ahead, Dean. No,
Yeah,
you go.
it's actually similar. It's interesting because I think you actually hear the same concept arise in a lot of like Eastern philosophies, like Zen, um, where the truth or the understanding, usually the understanding is something along the lines of like consciousness is the core primitive, um, can't be communicated through language. It must be realized through direct investigation. Because the moment you try to speak about it with language, you present a symbol of the thing as opposed to the real thing itself. And that symbol now can be interacted with others' belief systems and gets manipulated, right? And I think that's why so much of like spirituality has this kind of like woo woo side to it, where like the moment you start talking about things like pure love and consciousness, suddenly like someone's like now like doing crystal stuff with it. It's become its own different thing as like other people try to talk about it, right? So I do I obviously don't agree with the idea that no one should be literate, but I also think that there's certain truths which the moment you try to communicate about them, now it introduces the possibility of being misrepresented. And so sometimes certain truths are better to be realized through direct experience and through direct investigation. That's why so many of the meditative practices are really about like being by yourself and looking inwards.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that also underscores the thought that we have as a recurring theme, which is um, knowledge or truth as a process, and that everybody in the future, it ideally, if we could just like click button, level up everybody's philosophy game and ability to discern truth and knowledge and empathy for each other, world would be a better place, and I think we'd be better prepared to take on some of the bigger changes. Jonathan, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think if you apply that thought experiment to like how can you apply computational language to like disambiguate what it means to be a bat, and then like so okay, imagine that we have the computational power to like analyze the entire embryonic process of a bat from the time that it like starts mitosis and spatula, it's 400 cells, and then starts to like epigenetically express itself, and if we have the technology that we could use latent space languages that would actually describe like the cells in all of their ancestry, like in terms of like what their entire lineage is. You're disambiguating to the maximum extent that our knowledge can possibly describe through language, and so like imagine this model of a bat, right? And then so we know the entire epigenetic process. We have the entire familial relation of every one of its cells and its DNA and its epigenetic expression. We can simulate its organs, its systems, its behaviors, all through like appropriate language that like an LLM has made that's somewhat predictive of all these different constructs. Um, and then we ask, what is it to be a bat, right? And I think that what we could simulate and what we project then would still not be exactly what it is to be a bat, but it would be a more representative subjective profile of what that bat is than we could ever take on by observing it ourselves. And that's what I think that's what I think Bratton's really getting at is sort of like the if you take computation all the way to the integration of every aspect of being and disambiguate every aspect of evolution and every being, and we know that about everything all at once in the entire planet. That's the new sphere, right? And that we can perspective take one another with not perfect precision. We can't perfectly know each other's consciousness, but we can know it the best that language of any kind can possibly describe it in the instant that we need to know it.
Um, Funny story. I just decided to ask ChatGPT, what's it like to be a bat? Let me just read a couple things. It might be hilarious. To be a bat is to live in a world beyond human perception. it's already not great. A reality shaped by sound, motion, and a constant negotiation with error. Oh, this part's better. Imagine this: you're hanging upside down in a dark cave, your tiny claws gripping onto rock. The world around you is a vast three-dimensional tapestry of echoes. Your eyes can see, but they are secondary. True vision comes from your ears. You chirp, a high-pitched sound humans can't even hear. And in an instant, the entire room comes to life. Every surface, every object, every tiny insect in the air reflects sound back to you. Your brain assembles a moving, pulsating map of your surroundings. There's more, but that's interesting to think about this as artificialization, and then what you just said, Jonathan, which is, maybe we can never get to 100% perspective taking, but with these tools, we can get more than what we have today.
I actually had a note on that. I actually think it's interesting. I think, like, Jonathan, if I could like maybe rephrase your argument, you're saying that if I could, would reductive be the right word to use here? Or would you say that's maybe like pejorative in this context? That basically you're saying that, okay, if we can produce the entire structure of the bat, all the way from its homeostatic processes, not just at the level of its organs, but actually at the level of its cells, recursively up to the individual bat, then we have a better chance of simulating the batch consciousness than trying to observe it from the outside in. Um, would are we essentially saying that we believe that consciousness can be better explained through this kind of reductive approach of simulating all the layers? Alternatively, like, there's another way to look at kind of more abstract phenomena. I think David Deutsch talks about this in his book The Beginning of Infinity, and he's like, well, if I want to talk about why the statue of Winston Churchill, that's, I don't know where in England, exists, um, or if I talk about why, like, the specific nose in that statue is shaped the way it is it better to explain that through the way the the molecular structure of the statue is, and the entire history of how the atoms got there and how they were manufactured, or is it better just to talk about World War II as an explanation of, like, why that statue is there? Like, certain truths or abstract ideas actually don't lend themselves to reductionism. They are better explained at the level of abstraction, at a higher level of abstraction, and that can actually represent the idea using much fewer bits. So, do we potentially see that as being something that is the same with consciousness, or is there a reason why more reductive explanations might lend themselves to better explain consciousness?
Yeah, I'd probably use the word integrative versus reductive, just on that side of the philosophy. And I think that you're actually trying to describe, like, what's the consciousness of every aspect of the being, like, and so your question, like, which is more explanatory? It's funny. I actually did a Perplexity deep research query on Deutsch's philosophy versus Bratton's, and it was like, I think their main point was, like, Bratton's really coming from a standpoint of, like, trying to design social systems, whereas Deutsch is more trying to like use epistemology to for its explanatory power in abstract concepts,
Yeah.
which I yeah. Which is interesting, and I kind of like, um, so if I'm modeling a bat, I skew a little bit more towards Bratton's bias here, just in the terms of, like, how is the whole system working together, and, like, if we, like, in theories like IIT or mutual information theory that can measure a quantity of, like, agency or consciousness at each homeostatic function with each cell, cell organelles, subsystems. Um, I think if we can just understand all the aspects of consciousness and how they integrate together to form the holistic decision that the being's going to make in response to, like, some sound in its environment or a bug flying by, um, that's the most explanatory. Um, and so I think Deutsch's philosophy is more, like, practical, you know, without all the like. So I think he might have a different take if we had perfect computational information of all the beings on the planet, like, that his philosophy might evolve in step with it. I'm not sure. I've been wanting to read his stuff more.
Yeah, I actually don't know how Deutsch would thought to think about this problem. I just think it's an interesting, like, kind of fork in the road to think about how to approach, like, the problems of consciousness. I actually don't know which one would be better here. I mean, I would think we would learn more from trying to model it through this integrative approach, and we'd probably understand what levels of abstraction we're missing if the right answer was to model it from an abstract perspective. So I would probably bet that using the integrative approach is the right first step to take here.
It occurred to me like that you know, like what is the biological age of the bat, and modeling that, like our conversation today isn't too far away from the models themselves that we're building for biological age at this moment. Um, and like we talked about grip strength before, and like um, having well, human grip strength, but also like a human dead hang measurement, and then like some, you could take sub measurements of grip strength that like correlate to one another. So like in all of these biomarkers that are sort of like objectively analyzed through an observation context and then brought into a model of self and sort of a homeostatic system that is supposed to like be keeping you alive. I think that like the practical that we're actually like working on today in code has many metaphors to like this abstract bat that we're talking about, and I just think that's pretty cool. From your epigenetic data to your organ biological age, you can model these things that not only are at different levels of abstraction throughout your consciousness, but also correlate to one another. And then it can take the superset of like the things we have in common and what we have that are different from one another to get some aspect of like what's it like to be you versus what's it like to be me, um, at least in these dimensions that we're talking about right now.
Maybe it's an experiment where you get 1,000 humans and you're like, let's like put you in this VR thing. For some of you, we don't, and then we see some measurement of have you increased empathy for bats. Like, oh, that would be.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought experiment.
I know we're running a little against time here, so there's a few different ways that we could kind of branch the conversation to close out. I think the concepts here are very fascinating, and we haven't even touched on all the other things he's talked about. So I wanted to open the floor, Jonathan, Dean, from the talk. Are there any other things you all wanted to chat about from the Bratton talk?
I really like the way that this conversation went today in the podcast. I thought it led into a lot of really interesting like side quests. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I'm still not left convinced, or maybe I don't quite understand why his proposal for an epistemic institution is maybe better. I agree that we do need better epistemic institutions. So I'd love to maybe like follow up and dig more into some of his other research to understand that. But I thought Jonathan actually conceptualized some of the things that he was talking about with regards to what is computation as artificializing us actually mean, and contextualizing that in terms of epistemic me. Yeah, I thought that actually elucidated a lot of that talk really well.
Cool. Yeah, I like the way the conversation went today too. I thought it was very, very interesting. Hit a lot of the major, subtopics of the paper. There's a number of things you could talk like the allocentric kind of framing that he used. I thought that was like a really good word, like egocentric versus allocentric, and how that's helpful. And I also thought, yeah, I think it's one of the first words he introduced in the talk. I think Copernican crisis was mentioned, which I also like thought was a cool word. And like, remember all of Western civilization used to think that we're at the center of the universe, egocentric, like, and then allocentric is like, let's look at everything else and see what we are in relative to terms to that. So, and I do think that's like a lot of like we talk about perspective taking. If we can perspective take all the beings in the world and like be truly allocentric all the time, our cognition would be much different. Like we're very self-centric, sort of out of necessity, and we're needing to grow out of that for just natural fitness purposes, right, as a societal construct. And I think that's what Bratton was saying. And and don't forget, like the context here, he was talking to people that have donated to the Long Now Foundation, which are trying to imagine 10,000 years in the future, which is just like really interesting. Because I was sitting there thinking at the beginning, I was like, there's all these like pretty like wealthy to do, tech people, like old retired people in this room. Like, I wonder why they're not thinking about longevity more, because there's like 2,000 people in the room, something like that, right? There's a lot of interest, there's a lot of donation, and they're thinking about 10,000 years in the future. And I think, like, okay, they brought in a speaker who has a lens that says like how things will change, or at least a framework for change. I don't know if you can actually say what 10,000 years of computational evolution is going to look like, but he kind of took it to like, let's see what's going to happen to the planet. And I think that was also like a really interesting way to look at it. And so like the allocentric view that he used was this thing called the noosphere, which I've heard in different like philosophical circles before, but I always thought it was like a Web3 kind of like out there term. But no, he used it to like forecast what the world might be in 10,000 years, and I thought that was also kind of like a unique reach of an academic presentation.
He had this great slide in there, which is history of the Earth in 15 words. Lithosphere makes a biosphere that makes a technosphere that is now part of the noosphere.
Yeah.
That was pretty sweet.
And the climate thing you brought up earlier too, I think was really illustrative. Like, because there's one view that you can say like, oh my God, humans are bad and we created climate change, and the Anthropocene is just like the end of the Earth, right? And that's how it feels every day, like especially like in the news cycles. And he's saying like, no, this is just the Earth evolving. Like, there's like satellites in the sky, there's plastic in the water. Like, welcome to, and welcome to your new artificialized environment that helps you self-actualize your agency. And then get to the next level, right? And I think that's like a much more sort of constructive way to look at what is happening, planetary wise. Is like, how do we quantify it? How do we reflect? How do we then take agency and then evolve it? Which involves evolving collective consciousness.
Well, okay. So just to comment on the whole, it feels like that every day, that we're just like killing ourselves, like climate change is real. Like even one of the things is my condo in Oakland, apparently I looked at some water maps or whatever, and in 10 years I could expect the water line only like 5 or 10 blocks away from my condo. And I'm like, oh, wow. Like, so it's a very like in your face, right? And there's this feeling of like, oh shit, we're all doomed, or we're not going to be able to solve this. But I like the framing of, actually, we have data now to even describe this as a problem for the general populace. And then zooming out, like, let's think about how this is a relative point in time, where now that we have the sensors, now that we have the data, what do we do? And what you said, Jonathan, I think is spot on, is there's just needs to be more collective consciousness grown towards, hey, this is a big problem. And same as the longevity problem, right? Like you pose like, hey, there's all these people in this room not thinking about longevity, but they're thinking about what should we be doing in 10,000 years. And obviously there's some like intersection there. And I think that's actually part of it. It's just the whole, people have perceptions about reality, and then you come across a talk, it disrupts it with some evidence points and gets you thinking, or sensors from climate change, or some report given in some way gives you data and kind of changes your mind on things. And if enough agents in the world with enough influence get to a point of that shared consciousness around the problem or how serious it is, then I think things can change. And I think that is part of his whole technology evolution and scaffolding concept. So, Deen, you mentioned, maybe to close out on this, you mentioned, I love the term side quests. You were like, oh, the conversation evolved really well and we came up with some side quests. Obviously, the main quest is Epistemic Me, but it sounds like, at least what I'm hearing is, I think us talking about all these thought experiments tells us, okay, cool, like we're kind of on the right track. It feels like with Epistemic Me, where let's get all the data we possibly freaking can and quantify subjectivity around all of that. And then perhaps that will help us on all of these side quests. That was my interpretation of that. But I'm curious what side quests that you had kind of identified, Deen. Maybe that's a good way to close it out.
Yeah, I think the podcast and what we're doing in Epistemic Me maybe serve two distinct purposes. Epistemic Me, we're on the quest of quantifying subjectivity, and there's a lot of like really great code artifacts that are getting produced. And at the same time, we're talking about these really high level concepts in the podcast. And I think maybe for the listener, I think it'd be good if you're looking at one or looking at the other, like try to take a look at both and try to understand how they merge together. I think that sometimes when looking at the code, especially if you're development minded, try and look around and see if you can hear some of the concepts that we're talking about: epistemology, observation, context. If you can actually wrestle with these abstractions in the code, and see if they align with what we're talking about in the podcast. I think those two things are really mutually beneficial. I think that one isn't complete without the other. So to round that out, it may seem like they're going in two completely different directions, but I actually think seen together, it's really cool to complement each other quite well.
Close it out there. I don't think I could close out any better, but I'll thank you too, Deen, Jonathan. Thanks for joining me on the pod today to have this conversation about planetary computational philosophy and the Benjamin Bratton talk. I'm sure this is not the first time we'll be talking about whether we'll know what it's like to see green the same way, or to experience what a bat is like, or the side quests and how they add up to the main quests and are very synergistic overall. And also to the viewers that heard Deen's call to action, like challenge us on the nouns. Like we love more, collective intelligence around this, and artificialization and sense making. Like that will make all of these concepts stronger in our SDK. So perfect. Thanks everybody for joining the ABCs for Building the Future podcast. Thank you, Deen. Thank you, Jonathan. This has been a wonderful conversation on consciousness, philosophy, and so much more. So we will catch you next time. Take care. Have a great day.